I and a man working with us called Ali set about on an old beat-up motorbike, riding around looking for children in trouble.
A group of men tried to kidnap her.
There's a witch doctor religion here that targets special needs children, saying they are free of sin. I have seen children starved, tied up, abused, burned.
They have survived on a diet of nothing but carbohydrate.
It's not right. Our priority in life on this planet, our priorities have just gone awry, gone amiss completely.
Thanks to the love, support of the community that has followed us here on YouTube, we have been able to build a village for special needs children in crisis. If you are interested in finding out more about that, you can check out our website for specific details on our partnership program. We welcome any prayers. We believe deeply in this where we are in our lives. The longer I walk with God and speak to so many about spirit and about spiritual rebirth and about the supernatural life, the supernatural power that every human is entitled to and should be having, I recognize that the majority of people have an extreme interest in things like the notion of angels or extraterrestrials, aliens, demons, and people are deeply intrigued by this, but not so intrigued by the inner work that we all must go through and can't skip over, which leads many of us to see these things, to interact with these elements of reality. Most don't want to do the work to deprogram the 3D self. There is a multi-dimensional soul here inside your human body, and it is entangled in what I have often labeled a slave technology, a technology that makes you focus on the 3D. And that technology is very alluring, and it makes you believe that you are a personal history and this image of who you are built on top of that stack of memories. And so to deprogram that is to begin to, in consciousness, access the bandwidth of reality where you see these beings, where you hear these beings. And yet most aren't interested in that work. They will skip over it to be entertained by testimonials or stories about it. But I urge you to understand that deprogramming and inner engineering yourself as a being away from 3D into, I just made a video prior where I said 5D, from flesh to spirit. This is non-negotiable. You have to be able to untangle yourself from the personal history and personal self and the mind's want to make you a 3D being with a 3D identity. You have to do that work, and when you do that work, which is the core priority in every human life, then these things come. But I want nevertheless to speak about this because the presence of angels, as an example, this word that we have used to speak at this other dimensional force that works on behalf of the love of God, is something that is present in my life. It is absolutely something that is present. Now the other side of that is that, of course, as I've mentioned frequently, doing the work that I do spiritually, that the fallen angels and the demonic is also present as well. But another element is that extraterrestrials are also revealing themselves to us when we've done the inner engineering. In consciousness, when we shift from that 3D self, flesh self, to spirit self, extraterrestrials reveal themselves also. And no matter who you are, if you stay in the 3D operating system and you refuse to yield that identity, which is arrogance and pride, that sense of a separate you, separate from God, who must agree to the will of God, or must seek the will of God, if you don't agree to yield that operating system so as the will can animate your intelligence, so that new operating system, so you can die, and that new operating system, Christ, that higher love, can be born. You will constantly look for evidence with the 3D self for this, when the reality was, if you would just surrender, yield the 3D operating system, you would see them, and you would hear from them, and you would talk to them. Many years ago, when all of this began, this walk with God, like many of you, I began to embody more of the multidimensional being I am in the 3D body. And in doing that, I began to connect to a deeper layer of reality, which is the source code, the generous heart of God. And that has its own language. And it aligns things in synchronistic manners, and it speaks to you because it has space to, because your mind is not busy constantly analysing and planning and controlling the day, controlling your desires, controlling your ambitions for tomorrow, controlling other people, controlling everything around it. It's no longer doing that. And instead of doing that, now there is a certain silence about your internal world, whereby the source code of God can move you, can move with you, spirit can move you. And in that space I received at first, for it was where I could decode the bandwidth at that point in my evolution, I was receiving a lot of numerical synchronicities, and it was 1111, a very common one, which is God, the source code, catching your attention, clicking its fingers, and saying, take a look here, take a look there. And you would wake up at 11:11, or indeed, I only flew to Tanzania because I received the email at the end of an 11-day water fast that I started on the 11th of November, and I received the email at 11:11 a.m. And therefore I knew I was called to Africa for something, to Tanzania. I did not know why, but this is what happened. As that was happening, a lot of people said this is angel numbers, but I realized it wasn't. It was the source code. It was God, therefore, communicating and leading this soul inside this 3D mind out of the patterns of the 3D and into the new spirit, supernatural 5D life. If we want to use this 3D, 5D notion, I think it's quite useful in using language like this, but flesh, spirit, it's moving into spirit. And as that progressed, then I began to hear and be guided by angelic beings. At first I couldn't see them, but I would hear from them, and they began to assist with what we were doing out in Tanzania. And at first I began to question, is it the parents of the deceased parents of these children that I have become guardian of? Is it? But as time went on, I understood that in science we have angles of light, and angles of light carry on them photons, and photons carry information, and those angles of light reach your eyes, go into your eyes, hit your pineal, which is the seat of your soul ultimately, and in that space you receive a message. Now the message can come from a good angle, from the Christic, from God, or it can come from a bad angle, from the fallen angles, and they can lead you into temptation or lead you to higher good. And so the demonic are also moving on these angles in the realm of the function of this 3D matrix in that sense. It doesn't mean they are a photon, it means to reach the body of the human. This is how they are scientifically operating, it would seem. And so I began to understand that I was receiving messages from these beings, and I understood by what they were leading us to do and what they were supporting us in that they were clearly on the side of the Christic. But I also began to have pushback that revealed that there was something else going on. Certain times I would be around certain scenarios, people who had fallen desperately drug addicts, children, young men who had murdered, who had raped, and all of a sudden you would pick up interference and you would hear things, and I recognized that they were carrying something in their energy field that was also sending messages. And so the ability to have your receiver open to the higher spiritual realm is important, but you have to also be able to have discipline to know when you are being tempted away from the truth of the Christic, or when you're being led into the work of the Christic. These beings continued to guide, and I began to hear them clairaudibly. And the first time I saw a physical apparition of an angel, actual physical in the mind's eye, but overlaid on the actual reality that I was in, was during a time of prayer while I was using drums, actually. And when I got into a certain state, I popped out of my body, but I was where I was. And I could see exactly where I was, which was the children's village at Kilimanjaro. And I could see these beings that were made of blue light, and they were moving around and they were comforting some of our most traumatized children. They seemed to be blowing some sort of energy on them, is how it appeared. But they were featureless. They were human in shape, but they did not have eyes and mouths. They were featureless, and they radiated God's love. And I saw them briefly. Now, many, when you say angel, they want it to fit a biblical description. But I would not think that any of you would cope with seeing a manifestation of some of the biblical descriptions of an angel, because they're quite overwhelming, they're quite intense. And so perhaps it just takes a form that you can see, or perhaps this is their form. But I do know that they were angelic, and just because it's not written in a Bible, for example, the Bible is not a record of everything God ever did in creation. Look out through a telescope at everything that's going on out there, the nebulas, the galaxies. It's phenomenal, the amount of potential life and creation that's out there. And so I do not feel this book is a manual to say this is all that was ever done in creation. And so these beings were angelic, and they are also the beings who have been supporting me in my recovery. I had a very, and still do have a struggle, a fight to restore my full health to what it was. And I think there was a spiritual element to that. But the videos on my channel of them prodding me, these angels in meditation where I was in a high enough frequency, and I'm going to get onto this, why angels aren't always able to interfere. I was in a high enough frequency, I saw them, and they came and they prodded me in the liver. I felt the pain. Many weeks later, I felt the pain again in real life, not just in the meditation, and that week passed a lot of stones from my body. What those stones were is open to interpretation, a very heavy, dark energy that I had collected in my life doing what I was in Tanzania, and not really offering the greatest and highest, most difficult love is self-love in among all of that. And that's a topic for another video. And so I've seen these angelic beings heal, and they are angels. But they continue to assist us, and they continue to deliver messages to people when we need it to help these children. And they have the same unified goal as the one that Spirit gave me, as God gave me, to bring that love without a condition and bring an end to the suffering that's not needed by opening that love up and automatically becoming a being that shares. Like some of the tribes in Tanzania who don't have a word for sharing. They don't have a word for welcome. Not because they don't share, but because they have no notion of it, because it's automatic. Not because they don't welcome you, but it's because you're always welcome, so there's no word for it. There's no notion of that. There's no need to say you would not be welcome, so there's no word for it, such as the Maasai that I am part of. It's a beautiful way of having a community. It's different. And so, when I continue to do this, I don't seek angels, I never have. But I have learned about them. And what I learned is a reflection in our own lives. that they require a certain frequency in this 3D realm which is very dense compared to their home realm, their home dimension. The 3D realm is profoundly dense and heavy. We as humans have to open up a space where it's easy for them to work here. Otherwise they too can get drained and harmed inside this realm. This is where purity is non-negotiable. When we move in purity, we anchor a certain frequency around us, and we allow them to be around us, to work around us. And those who don't anchor purity, who anchor the opposite, they open a certain field that allows the heavier other dimensional beings, the demonic, to move in their life and make them suffer. And so we want the purity, we want to anchor the angelic so they can move around in our life with more ease, so they can assist us and guide on behalf of God. But we must never pray to them or worship them, is my experience. They don't like it, they don't want it. They're always, no, go to source, and source will send what source sends, and if we are it, we are it. And so just as with us when we are helping heroin addicts out in Africa, if you go to the drug den every day, you get drained and exhausted by what you're seeing where you're going to, and you run out of energy to help. And eventually, out of self-preservation, you no longer descend to their realm to help them. The angelic are the same. But if you can allow them to come to you, if you open your office and say, come when you need the help, come, and they come, you are able to do it every day, because your environment, your frequency where you are abiding within is of one of comfort, and it's likewise with the angelic. But they need you to provide that frequency for them. That means that you need to go to their office by elevating your frequency. In the Quran, there's a time where the angel won't enter the house because there's a dog under the bed. But what people missed is that in that culture, dogs represented mystically the lower nature. And so when the lower nature is still present with you, it's very hard to hear the frequency of the angelic. When the impulses of the 3D you are still governing what you do, it's very hard for the angelic to be present in your home, with you, around you, in your energy field around you. And so you must ensure that that lower nature is not with you. Now I mention extraterrestrials because the interesting thing for me as a man has been that I recognize now that there are definitely extraterrestrials. There's not even a question about it. I have seen a UFO that was clearly piloted by a higher dimensional force that recognized my space whereby I was elevating into another dimension during a long water fast. 16 days of water fasting. The final day, everything synchronized, so as I would be laid on the garden floor, looking up at the stars, which I never do at night time, with my wonderful wife, and this huge craft comes over. And it happened on the same day that the Mayan culture called the day out of time. They say a time where the veil between the 3D matrix and the rest of the other dimensions is thin. I saw them physically in this world with my own eyes, not through my mind's eye. I saw them here. And as did my beautiful wife, who leapt up in shock and fear and started swearing, funnily enough. But I saw them. And I have also spoken with them. Now this is where the interesting question comes in sometimes. I had an out-of-body experience where I spoke to a species that was against humanity. And when I sat with that species, I asked what they were doing, and they likened it to me driving a car and hitting bugs. They said, do you have anything against the bugs, or are they just in the way of your journey? And I understood, but what they were getting at is that we were bugs on their car. But I also understood that I've seen them attached to people in this realm, this species. And I don't mistake this species with the demonic. They are an interdimensional species. Now, are they demonic in nature? Is their dimension a demonic realm? This is all wordplay. We're pointing at something that's not of this realm with these words. But I do say that there is a fallen species and there is a demonic species. The demonic want a body, the fallen don't need a body. That's how I determine it. Nevertheless, the fallen still want to access humans' energy fields to get energy. The demonic want to get in the human body because they don't have one, they don't have a body, so as they can experience some perversion that's kept them bound to the lower frequencies of the 3D. When I had that conversation with them, and they said that they had technology, and I know I've never sat and described them, and I still am not going to, because it will create a lot of chaos to go into that at this point, I would believe, to sit and describe these beings as I saw them. But they had technology. And so I saw them, and I recognized that, as I've said recently, that perhaps other dimensional life can embrace the satanic path. Perhaps alien life, other sentient life out there in the cosmos can embrace, in another dimension perhaps, can embrace the satanic path. If there's another planet with a different type of humanoid, they could embrace the satanic path, and that would be to challenge God and selfish ambition and lusts of pleasure endlessly, instead of serving the highest ideals of man and the greater love, to support one another, unblemished from the world. But therefore, I then one day in meditation have had interactions with other beings that are sentient and did not look to be the angelic that I speak of. They did not look to be those beings of light. They looked to have a 3D form, and they looked like a species as well. And they were of the Christic. Your discernment does not lie. Your ability in spirit to discern does not lie, because it's not your discernment. It's spirit's discernment that you feel in yourselves. And when I met them, I had a conversation with them, and again, I won't share fully all of that, but they provided me with some advice after they looked at something what was happening with my body, and that advice turned out to be true. Now, these beings were not, it would seem, of this dimension, this 3D grounded dimension that most of us function in, but they were from a higher dimension, nevertheless. And I then recognized that if sentient life, which I deeply am certain it does, exists all around this universe, if sentient life does exist all around the universe, which I have too many now interactions to say that's not possible, so it does in my perception, my view, because of all that I've seen and experienced and gone through, then sentient life can also choose the road of the Christic, and therefore could bring messages to those who have been harmed, species who have been harmed, for example, by the fallen behaviours of sentient life who chose the satanic path, such as those other dimensional sentient life force that I spoke with who didn't care about humanity. And when you look at that, and you look at something like the Bible, and you see Elijah taking off in a chariot of fire, and you see these stories of men dressed in linen carrying a weapon disembarking a craft, and you hear descriptions that discuss glowing metal in the midst of the chariot of fire that sounds like a thruster, then you recognize that perhaps indeed humans from other parts in the cosmos have embraced the Christic path as well, and may even have been coming here and bringing people like Elijah, who's a friend of Yeshua, and taking them somewhere, because they too had understood the highest of high is to choose the operating system that is the will of that great love that manifests all things, the source code of all things, the generous heart of God, our wonderful loving parent. They can choose that road too. and therefore also a species could be split. And so I say all of this because how many times in history, in ancient history, was the benevolent, loving interference of another dimensional species or a 3D species who visited this earth documented as an angel? Who knows? It's quite possible. I know that much. It is quite possible. But if you struggle and say, I don't believe this, I'm going to say something that's a fact in my life. Every single human being I know, every, who has chosen to surrender and yield the 3D personal self and its obsessive need for analysis and its obsessive need for control, every human that I know who has done that has begun to move and decode a bandwidth of reality where they too have either seen the angelic, the demonic, or extraterrestrials, or all three, without any exception in my life. And therefore I believe that we humans as supernatural beings, which is what we are, which is what Yeshua promised that you would be, for example. Yeshua absolutely promised that you would have supernatural power. Promised. And yet most don't have it. Promised you would have extreme peace and love in your heart constantly, and yet most don't have it. And yet many do. Believe me, it's there. That when we get to that supernatural side of ourselves, we decode a bandwidth of reality where we become interdimensional, for we need it to progress the love of the kingdom in this world. We need to be able to heal. We need to be able to drive out entities. We need to be able to hear messages from God. We need to be able to have authority over situations inside this reality. And beyond there, it would seem that sometimes that God may well send, as with us. I've seen God clearly synchronize my life to rescue dogs. Clearly. Another species. Clearly, God has synchronized in events you can't believe for me to be in front of a dog that needed rescuing. Many times. Like recently when I travelled to Tanzania, I got off the plane, I hadn't even gone to my home, and I felt an urge in my car to turn a certain street that didn't lead to my home, and I rescued a puppy because of it. How many times does the source code of great love, who does care, see someone suffering and call on another species that's not necessarily angelic to come and help them? It's completely possible, and in my life I've seen it on one occasion definitely happen. When I connected in meditation to spirit, there I was brought to these loving beings that were in a higher spiritual realm that seemed to have a physical body, not a light body. And they offered me some advice that was true about my body. A certain herb, they told me about a certain herb. Life is magic. It's supernatural. And we are interdimensional beings who were always supposed to be able to commune with angels and have authority over the opposite. Don't let the personal history and the personal you that the education system has solidified so heavily inside you block you from knowing that for yourself. Not through being entertained by it, but by seeing it, knowing it, walking in it, as many of us are blessed to do. That was all. God bless, guys.